mpaka Ijumaa, moja kwa moja kutoka VOA.
Hello, I'm Esther Githui-Ewart. It's Thursday, November 10th. This is Africa 54.
While the Republican Party made gains in Tuesday's U.S. elections, control of Congress is still undecided. VOA's congressional correspondent Katherine Gibson reports on what can happen when neither party has a commanding majority. As world leaders gather in Egypt for the COP27 Climate Summit, rising sea levels threaten that nation's ancient port city, Alexandria. VOA has a report from the scene. 2 U.S. senators met with members of the African Diaspora community to discuss U.S.-Africa policy and other issues. We'll take a close look. All this and much more on today's Africa 54.
We begin in the United States, where Republicans are inching closer on Thursday to securing a majority in the House of Representatives as ballots continue to be counted in key Senate and House races across the nation. VOA's congressional correspondent Katherine Gibson has more.
U.S. President Joe Biden still does not know if he will work with a Democratic-controlled Congress for the next 2 years, but he is already claiming victory.
While the press and the pundits are predicting a giant red wave, it didn't happen.
Historically, U.S. presidents have seen major losses for their party in midterm elections. But Democrats won tough re-election races in places like the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C., preventing Republicans from securing a significant majority in the U.S. House. Republican Representative Kevin McCarthy will still likely be the next Speaker of the House.
Republicans will work with anyone who's willing to join us to deliver this new direction that Americans have demanded.
But analysts say his agenda will be limited by managing Trump-endorsed members of Congress.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult for Kevin McCarthy to be able to maintain cohesion, because let's say in the case, which is now becoming more plausible, that it might be a tiny majority, single digits, that requires a real skill in any circumstance to be able to keep that caucus, united.
There were also unexpectedly close Senate results nationwide, including a significant win in the northeastern state of Pennsylvania. John Fetterman beating Republican candidate Dr. Mehmet Oz to keep the possibility of a Democratic Senate majority alive.
Protecting a woman's right to choose, raising our minimum wage, fighting the union way of life. Healthcare is a fundamental human right.
Analysts say those priorities will be difficult to pass if Democrats only have a tie-breaking vote from Vice President Kamala Harris.
The concern is that some of the issues that people entrusted, these candidates and what they were running on are not going to be actually reflected in the day-to-day.
For the second time in 2 years, Georgia voters could potentially decide control of the U.S. Senate in a special runoff election between Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock and Republican candidate Herschel Walker. Some Georgia voters say it's important not to give a mandate to either party.
I think we just need to get back to middle of the road. I think we've gone too far left, too far toward special interests.
And they're also aware of the costs of shifting power from one party to another.
It feels like as soon as we get something going really good, we flip-flop and go the other way, and it's just been a back and forth, seems like forever. So, but it is what it is. You know, that's democracy.
The final balance of power may not be known until December 6th, when voters will choose between Warnock and Walker. Catherine Gibson, VOA News, Atlanta, Georgia.
For more on the U.S. midterm elections, I'm joined by Steve Reddish, VOA News Center executive producer. Steve, welcome back, and tell us more about the results and what to look out for next.
Right now, we are looking mainly to the western part of the United States for some sort of idea of how this is going to play out. Two states next to each other, Nevada and Arizona, still have lots of votes to count. About 1/4 in each state. Nevada a little less, and Arizona a little more. And the Senate race in both states are very tight. In Nevada, the Republican is leading, and in Arizona, the Democrat is leading. If those hold, we're going to be looking back to the east, and a December election, a runoff election in Georgia, between Senator Raphael Warnock and football icon in Georgia, Herschel Walker, and that will determine which party holds the Senate. We're still looking to the west, mostly in California, for very tight congressional races that are going to determine whether or not the House moves into the Republican hands or stays in Democratic hands.
You know, I don't recall recently seeing a tight race like this one when it comes to midterm elections. Is it likely that Democrats might lose control of the House?
The way things look now, where with candidates, Republican candidates leading in many of these undecided, still to be finished counting districts, it looks like Republicans will have the majority in the House with a slight couple, three, maybe a handful of seats. It will be a very slim majority for the Republican leader to be able to manage.
And what happens next if they do win the control of the House?
The Republican leader will have a very difficult time handling the very far right wing of his party. They will want to hold investigations, perhaps want to impeach President Biden. And with that small minority within that large caucus, the Republicans could see a lot of interfighting and likely not much of President Biden's agenda moving forward over the next couple of years.
Steve, as always, excellent analysis.
Thank you.
Steve Reddish is an executive producer for VOA News Center. As world leaders gather in Egypt in an attempt to slow global warming, rising sea levels are already encroaching upon the country's famed ancient port city, Alexandria, and it's wreaking havoc on the lives of the poor. Heather Murdoch reports with Hamada El Saram from Alexandria.
For years, cement blocks have been piled on the shores of the ancient Egyptian port city of Alexandria to keep the sea at bay. But by 2050, as the Earth's temperature rises, much of the city is expected to be underwater. Locals say the prospect is terrifying.
It is a scary thing, but I am one person. There's nothing I can do about it. We have heard Alexandria will sink into the sea, but we don't know when or even if it's true.
Flooding has already destroyed properties and displaced families in Alexandria. Families that are almost always part of the 1/3 of the country's population living in poverty. World leaders are meeting this week at the UN Climate Change Conference, known as COP27, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, trying to devise ways to compensate the world's most vulnerable communities, which are also among the world's poorest. This year's UN Climate Conference is the first to formally address this contentious issue. making it a top agenda item, along with its main item, to reduce emissions worldwide to limit global warming, a long-established goal that is far from being met. Leaders say not acting on these dual goals could be catastrophic.
Experts are predicting as many as 1 billion climate migrants crossing international borders in the balance of this century. Think of the millions that are crossing borders now and the xenophobia and authoritarian populism that is caused by a large surge of refugees. And then imagine, if you will, what 1 billion climate refugees would do.
Unprecedented deadly fires, floods, heat waves, and storms have ravaged the earth this year, and experts say they are expected to get significantly worse in the future if the Earth's temperature continues to rise at its current pace. And in Alexandria, residents say it is obvious that wealthy countries are responsible for the damage.
Developing countries and poor countries don't have means like factories to pollute the air. It's the other countries creating the problem, and they should be responsible for fixing it.
He says he wonders whether Egyptians can start farming in the deserts, as UN climate experts predict rising sea levels may wipe out nearly half the country's agricultural output within the next 40 years. For Hamada El-Rassam in Alexandria, Egypt, Heather Murdoch, VOA News.
For more on climate change and its impact on Africa, Kinyanjui Koimbori, an agriculture and climate change expert, joins me live via Skype from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Mr. Koimbori, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you so much for having me.
So much being said at Sharm el-Sheikh right now, but what challenges is Africa faced with when it comes to climate change?
Thank you so much. Yes, there are so many challenges that Africa is being faced with, but the main challenges is that climate change has impacted agriculture in Africa, putting in mind that over 80% of agriculture in Africa is rain-fed. So we have had an issue of agriculture being affected by rainfall. And all I can say is that also we have been affected negatively when it comes to our water bodies being contaminated. We are having issues of even our infrastructure being destroyed because we have not been climate proofed. So yes, the problems of climate change in Africa, they are catastrophic at this moment.
And what parts of Africa are most impacted and how?
Yes, most of the Africa, out of the 54 countries or 55 in Africa, I can say that almost 90% of them have felt the impacts of climate change. And the worst hit, there are around 10% of them, that is Kenya and the Horn of Africa. In fact, there has been an estimated 40 million people who have been rendered climate change refugees because of the impacts of climate change. We have lost a magnitude of animals due to drought, and this leads to the release of methane when the animals die. Also, we have seen drought, which has led to famine. So the catastrophic effects have been huge, even to the economy, because we have had huge economic backdrops. This is the first time in Africa we're actually feeding wild animals, like even elephants. This is something we have never had to do or even tackle. We're even allocating money that has been allocated for health and education to go into fighting climate change. So it has impacted all sectors, and especially most of the countries in Horn Africa and Kenya.
And what are African leaders they are proposing to do in order to effectively deal with the effects of this climate change?
Yes, in this COP27 meeting that we have in, yes, there are over 130 world leaders and over 30,000 delegates globally. But in Africa, we have seen a handful of them, which is also a big backdrop. We had around 20 to 30 African leaders being available. But these African leaders, what they're calling for is they want to see financial aid being given to developing nations so that we can be able to adapt and mitigate against climate change. So this is a clarion call. We are calling to the developed nations to put up and to meet their pledges of the $100 billion yearly that was supposed to go into the Green Climate Fund. And if not, as the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said, that we are heading towards climate hell. And the accelerator is fully on if we do not help Africa in terms of combating climate change by giving them the financial aid that they need.
Mr. Koimburi, thank you very much for your insight. Kenyan Jui Koimburi is an agriculture and climate change expert. In Kenya, to reduce the impact of drought, a Dutch conservation group is helping ethnic Maasai to restore parched lands through rainwater harvesting. But with a failed rainy season forecast for the 5th time in a row, some are asking whether conservation efforts are enough. Juma Majanga has more from Amboseli.
God, remember us with rain, sing these ethnic Maasai in a traditional prayer song. The Maasai are herders, so the worst drought in 40 years has been shocking.
We have lost nearly all our livestock due to prolonged drought. As the Maasai, we depend on livestock for livelihood. That is why we have come together to dig these things to restore our degraded land and bring back the grass for livestock.
The Maasai's Kuku Community Group Ranch is between Kenya's Tsavo and Amboseli National Parks on the southern border with Tanzania, a sacred place reserved for grazing during droughts. But the record drought biting the Horn of Africa has not spared the ranch.
The community here is like totally in a mess, especially this drought that we are in right now, like 80% of livestock is normal. So you can imagine the problem is even becoming bigger and bigger with time.
Dutch conservation group Just Dig It is working with the Maasai Wilderness Conservation Trust to help the community restore parched lands. They are digging water bunds, semicircular shaped pits that capture rainwater and then reseeding the areas with grass. But they still need rain to get started.
If there's some rainfall and the seeds germinate and there's no follow-up rains, the seeds die off. But fortunately, the environment is so well adapted, even with little rain, the seeds germinate. And that's why we are also really trying to maximize the little rains that we get in the environment.
The green pasture is also needed to prevent human-wildlife conflict.
What causes elephants to invade farms is lack of water and pasture in the park. So if these grasses grow here, the animals will have their food and water in the park, and we will have peace.
Just Dig It says, in the past 2 years, they've built more than 273,000 bunds, helping restore nearly 5,000 acres of parched land. Growing and selling hay from grass seed banks has helped employ women, and the trust says grass restoration is boosting tourism.
Through such projects, we are able to improve the tourism footprint in the area because we have noticed that wildlife come to the restored sites.
As the clouds gather, the Maasai sing for the skies to open and the rains to start coming. Juma Majanga for VOA News, Amboseli, Kenya.
Famine and drought in Horn of Africa is forcing people to relocate to makeshift camps to seek assistance. The Somalia region of Ethiopia is dealing with a severe drought that is the longest in at least 40 years. VOA's Paul Ndiho reports.
Severe drought in the Horn of Africa is pushing residents to the brink of starvation, destroying crops and killing livestock on which their survival depends. The Somali region of Ethiopia is devastated and there has not been any measure of rain for 4 consecutive seasons. International Rescue Committee President and CEO David Miliband this week visited displaced communities impacted by drought.
And we've been meeting internally displaced people here who, from a conflict of 5 years ago, are still out of their homes, not yet returned to their homes. So the need for humanitarian aid is very pressing. The fact that the large parts of the international community, so-called, have not delivered on the humanitarian appeal that's been made for East Africa is very serious indeed. That's an urgent need to stave off the growing hunger crisis in this part of East Africa.
Miliband urged leaders attending the United Nations Climate Conference in Egypt to address the needs of the people in Somalia.
Big message for the leaders meeting in Egypt that comes out of the situation on the ground here is that if this is to be a truly African COP, an African conference of the parties, then it needs to be a COP that addresses the needs of people here today, because the people of this region are paying the price of the climate crisis already.
In other parts of Somalia, the city of Baidoa is seeing a large population of people displaced by drought, living in camps on the edges of the town. Humanitarian aid workers have set up life-saving facilities in some government-held areas, and vast regions of the country remain under the control of the militant Islamist Al-Shabaab fighting against the government.
The numbers we have and based on the experts, agencies that specialize collecting information and for food insecurity and nutritional needs. More than 1,600,000 people in Southwest are in need of food assistance.
According to humanitarian agencies, the drought has surpassed that of 2016 and 2017, increasing the need for humanitarian assistance. Weather forecasters are predicting a fifth below-average rain season, likely increasing the risk of famine in central and southern Somalia. The United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs says there has been a threefold increase in displacement since the beginning of 2022, as people desperately leave their communities in search of water, pasture, and food. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Sudanese authorities returned the ousted President Omar al-Bashir and 4 of his close allies back to Koba prison after spending nearly a year in a hospital in Khartoum. In April of 2021, some Sudanese activists posted video clips on social media showing al-Bashir in good health visiting patients in the army's Aliyah hospital in Khartoum. The video clip sparked widespread controversy over the reality of al-Bashir's illness. Al-Bashir is being tried along with other leaders of the National Islamic Front for planning the June 1989 coup. We're excited to hear what you think about Africa 54 in all our VOA Africa programs on our VOA website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, discussing issues pertinent to the African diaspora. We'll be back.
The UN Women says rural women are critical in ensuring household and community sustainability, improving rural livelihoods. However, they are continuing to face discrimination over land and livestock ownership, equal pay, and access to resources. On this week's episode of Our Voices, we examine the day-to-day life challenges and success stories of rural women in parts of Africa. We also look into the programs that assist them in fulfilling their roles as caregivers in their communities. Join the conversation each week right here on Our Voices.
In other news, Somalia's information ministry says its army and associated clan militias have killed at least 20 Al-Shabaab fighters in towns in the center of the country. Thousands of public workers in South Africa walked out Thursday in a nationwide strike over wages after talks with government broke down, threatening essential services. Health ministry officials in Malawi say cholera has killed 214 people, but infections from one of the country's worst outbreaks in a decade have started to abate after peaking last month. U.S. Senators Mark Warner and Tim Kaine recently hosted a discussion with members of the African diaspora community in Northern Virginia. The participants discussed U.S.-Africa policy and other issues pertinent to the diaspora. VOA's Lenomudu has the details.
Data shows that Virginia is home to over 115,000 Africans in the diaspora community. Some of them gathered here to meet with United States Democratic Senators Mark Warner and Tim Kaine.
As someone who's worked in the policy world for about 12 years, I know the importance of having African voices and policymakers and business folks coming together. It's a powerful tool.
Findings by the New American Economy Research show that the African diaspora is one of the fastest growing population of immigrants in the United States, with a 50% increase from 2010 to 2018. For Senator Tim Kaine, it is an opportunity.
So we're seeing this all over the Commonwealth. We need to recognize it as a value. There's sort of a competition to some degree in terms of influence in Africa between the United States, Russia, and China. Russia and China have assets, but what they don't have is an African diaspora community. So why don't we view our African-American population, and especially our African diaspora community, as a connection point with Africa?
Some of the attendees said the meeting afforded them an opportunity to convey the diaspora's concerns and suggestions to the current U.S. administration.
In terms of policy and in terms of economic development, I think them being able to see the plethora of African talent here, the different businesses, what we do, technology, climate change, innovation, they're able to take that back and see how they can utilize that to work with African countries and increase economic development.
Observers say African immigrants make significant contributions to the U.S. economy as entrepreneurs. U.S. Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Wally Adeyemo, the highest-ranking diaspora member in the Biden administration, said various measures are in place to improve the business landscape for small businesses in America and abroad.
At Treasury, we have a relatively small budget, but we're making sure that of that money, we're trying to devote as much as possible of it to minority-run businesses. But I know that many of you, in addition to being interested in doing business here, want to be able to do business back home. And a big part of that is not only the DFC and MCC, but it's also us being in a position where, as the United States of America, we think more broadly than just about what we can do here, be it AGOA or other relationships.
Democratic Senator Mark Warner has worked extensively on U.S.-Africa relations in countries such as Kenya and Ethiopia.
We need to do more trade deals with Africa. Recently, there's been a U.S.-Kenya trade deal announced. I think we need more. I would love to see us continue to support democratic reform, for example, in Ethiopia, a very important country. I think we need to guarantee human rights in Sudan. So we need more engagement there. Secondly, the American military's headquarters for Africa is in Germany. That's crazy. Senator Kaine and I both agreed that we would commit to try to move that headquarters to Africa. And then finally, the administration is going to have a summit with African leaders coming later this year. I want to make sure that members of the diaspora are involved in planning that summit.
U.S. President Joe Biden is scheduled to host leaders from across the African continent during the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. from December 13 to 15. Linor Moudou, VOA News, Alexandria, Virginia.
And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.